Can I help you?
Yes, you can. My name's Edward Kelly.
His mates call him Ned. Ned Kelly? You sure I've heard that name somewhere?
I'm sure you have, sir.
No, I don't know who shot me.
Well, you have your eyes shut at the time, or what?
Yeah, well, I've got no idea really who shot me.
Australia has a very unique criminal history, beginning with its settlements of prison colonies in the late 18th century, bushrangers, bank robberies, ghastly serial killers, and criminal empires. It's all here in today's Top 10 countdown of Australia's biggest crimes. Welcome back to another Shadow Matter Sunday. Hope you're all doing well. If it's your first time here, hello, g'day. You can find me here every second Sunday for a look at a darker side of our world with a focus on stories and cases from Australia and New Zealand. If you want to be a bit morbid and fall asleep to creepy stories like my wife does, then why don't you listen to my podcast on Spotify? Search Shadow Matter on Spotify. Today's episode is the Top 10 Biggest Crimes in Australia's History, and wow, this was an even harder list to make compared to my previous video on New Zealand's biggest crimes. If you haven't seen that, I will link it below. The amount of huge crimes that I had to sift through, I'll probably have to make another video to cover them all. Anyway, enough with the rambling and let's get into it. Number 10, the first bank robbery in Australia. On the 14th of September 1828 in Sydney, New South Wales, the first bank robbery took place when thieves entered the strong room through a sewer drain and made off with £14,000 worth of notes and coins, today's equivalent of almost around 20 million. The bank in question was the Bank of Australia, founded 2 years prior, to compete with the older and fairly more established Bank of New South Wales. The managing director of the Bank of Australia hired a convict stonemason by the name of Thomas Turner to complete a job on the basement. His idea was to turn it into a strong room for the bank. However, Turner became aware of a design flaw. The strong room would be connected to a sewer drain that ran into the tank stream. Turner came up with the idea of entering the strong room through the sewer drain, but knew if he did so, he'd be an obvious suspect, so he turned to his good mate James Dingo, a shoemaker and ex-convict, who recruited other convicts and ex-convicts, George Farrell, also a shoemaker, William Blackstone, a blacksmith, and John Creighton, a slater and plasterer, who had laid the strong room floor. Blackstone's skills were put to use making specialized tools to remove bricks from the drain wall and stones from the strong room floor. Over the course of several weeks, the gang of criminals went to work in the sewer drain to remove bricks and break through the 5-foot-thick strong room floor. On Sunday, the 14th of September, 1828, the gang was successful, and they managed to empty the strong room of all its notes and gold and silver coins, totaling £14,000, which was a massive amount of money in those times. Adjusted for inflation, this would be around or just over $24 million today. The next day, the bank officials found that they had been robbed, and this marked the first bank robbery in Australia's recorded history. And not only that, it was a devastatingly large amount of cash and coins. The bank offered a monetary reward and took old notes out of circulation in order to capture the thieves and recover the loot. However, the full amount was never recovered. The Governor of New South Wales offered something a little more enticing to convicts of the colony: a full pardon if they dobbed in their accomplices. Initially, the gang kept a low profile and managed to remain undetected until William Blackstone confessed to the crime after he took the offer of a pardon in relation to another robbery he had committed. He ratted out his accomplices and was awarded £100, a full governor's pardon, and a free passage back to England. The money recovered was only about £2,500, which was well short of the full amount. It's rumoured that the money may still be hidden somewhere in Sydney today. Number 9, the Coniston Massacre. In 1928, the last documented massacre of First Nations people took place in Australia. Over 60 First Nations people were killed throughout the Central Desert region, leaving a traumatic mark on the lives of many. Over several months in 1928, 60 Aboriginal women, men and children were killed at different sites. These events became known as the Coniston Massacre. The massacre began after a white dingo tracker by the name of Fred Brooks was found murdered on Coniston Station in 1928. Brooks's body was found with traditional weapons in a shallow grave. After his death, a reprisal party was formed and led on horseback by Mounted Constable George Murray. The party was made up of both civilians and police. 2 Warlpiri men were arrested for the murder of Brooks. They were held in Darwin before being acquitted. They were found not guilty. There are many accounts by Aboriginal eyewitnesses that point to a man known as Bullfrog as the true killer of Brooks. In 1928, scarcity of resources like food and water had led to tensions between settlers and Aboriginal people across the Central Australian region. Accounts from 1928 highlight that Brooks was killed due to breaching Warlpiri marriage law. Brooks had been living at a waterhole called Uluru on the Coniston station near a group of Warlpiri people, including Bullfrog. Now, while Brooks did not have an Aboriginal wife, many first-person accounts highlight that he placed demands on Bullfrog's wives, and secondary accounts suggest that he may have sexually assaulted one of his wives. Marriage law was governed by Aboriginal law during this time, and breaking that law was a punishable offence. The violence that erupted at Coniston highlights the cultural misunderstandings that often created conflict throughout early colonisation. According to Warlpiri law, Bullfrog acted lawfully in exercising his traditional Aboriginal marriage law, but the consequences of the reprisal massacre were devastating for Aboriginal people across the region. First Nations people of that area mourn the loss of the family who were killed during the Coniston Massacre. The events of Coniston highlight the breakdown in British law during this time period. Settlers acted outside their law when the killings took place rather than allowing Bullfrog to be brought to trial. No one was charged for the more than 60 murders, and a board of inquiry was set up to investigate, and it ruled that the reprisal party had acted in self-defence. The memories of Coniston are still fresh for Aboriginal people across the Central Australian region. On Friday the 24th of August, people from all over the Northern Territory meet at Eureka Brooks Soak, and they do this to recognise and mourn the loss of loved ones who were killed in 1928. Number 8. The Eureka Rebellion. The rebellion at Eureka Stockade was the largest conflict in the colonial history of Australia and is seen by many as the birth of democracy in the country. The rebellion took place during the Victorian gold rush in 1854 and began with tensions rising between the gold miners in Ballarat, Victoria, and the political authorities governing the state. Grievances were taken by the miners, or diggers as they are commonly called, over the miners' imposed gold mining licensing fees and the brutal force used by police to collect those fees, the lack of the vote, and a lack of representation in the Legislative Council. A licensing fee increase was introduced in 1851, and many of the diggers cried out for reform on these issues. However, the miners would endure police harassment on these issues, and it all culminated in the death of a digger named James Scobie in October 1854, and the acquittal of his alleged killers by a government board of inquiry further inflamed the situation. By November 1854, the diggers had organised themselves into a paramilitary force of 150 men, and they built a barrier of wooden stakes to protect themselves, known as a stockade. The battle began on December 3, 1854, when troops and police surrounded the 150 diggers who were within the structure. The diggers opened fire on the government forces after they refused to come out of the stockade when they were asked to do so. The battle lasted 15 minutes and ended when the diggers retreated. The Eureka Stockade Rebellion saw the loss of 20 diggers and 5 troopers. When charged with treason, none of the diggers were convicted, and a year later, the aftermath of the rebellion saw an acceleration of reforms being made from 1855 onwards. Number 7. The Great Bookie Robbery. On April the 21st, 1976, one of, or if not the biggest, most successful heist took place at the Victoria Club in Melbourne. The heist is significant because an estimated $6 to $12 million were taken by a gang of thieves, and not one of them was ever caught. In fact, the crime remains officially classified as unsolved. The gang rented an office opposite the club that gave them clear views of their target and planned the job over the course of 3 months. Expertly timed with takings from the Easter weekend races, it was reported that it was the club's biggest haul ever. At around midday, one of the gang disguised himself as a refrigerator repairman and entered the club. He then walked to a fire exit and let 5 of his accomplices in, armed with World War II Owen machine guns. The gang quickly subdued the armed cash delivery guards who had just minutes before delivered over $1.2 million in cash. In just 15 minutes, the gang of 6 made off with the loot and made their way onto the street where 2 getaway vans were waiting for them. For many years, only the criminals of Melbourne's underworld knew who the members of the gang were, and even today, you can still get differing information on how and who was involved. However, most people commonly identify Melbourne underworld figure Raymond Chuck Bennett as the mastermind behind the audacious heist. The Victoria Club reported only $1.2 million stolen. However, this was due to them keeping the Australian Tax Office in the dark about how much they really brought in over the weekend, and its real figure may be somewhere between $8 to $12 million. I do have a full-length video on the Great Bookie Robbery, so if you haven't seen that, I will link it below. Number 6, Ned Kelly's last stand. Tell me you're Australian without telling me you're Australian. Think we can do better than that. Much better. Hell, even my dad was cremated in a Ned Kelly t-shirt. Rest in peace, Dad. Love ya. Now, if you grew up true blue, you already know the story inside out. But because I need time to fill out this video and I like talking about it, we're going to talk about it. Ned Kelly. Not only Australia's most famous or infamous outlaw, but recognised the world over as one of the most well-known and documented outlaws in history. This is arguably due to his last standoff with Victorian police, in which he and his gang donned suits of homemade armour. Born Edward Kelly around December 1854, the third of 8 children to Irish immigrant parents in what was then known as the colony of Victoria. Ned grew up in times of squatters and selectors and the Victorian gold rush, both attributed to political tensions among the elite ruling class and the labourer working class, and these would have definitely affected young Ned Kelly. He was almost certainly a product of his time. Ned was mostly a good kid, even being gifted a green sash for his bravery when he saved another young boy from drowning, and stepped up as man of the house after his father died in 1866. The Kelly family made their income through selected farmland. However, the land was deemed inferior for farming, so they made up extra income by hosting lodges for travellers and selling sly grog. It wasn't until the early 1870s that Ned became the bushranging protege of notorious outlaw William Power, and it's around this time that Ned Kelly becomes known to the law. Being sentenced to prison in 1871 for illegally receiving a horse, Kelly re-entered society after 3 years and spent the next few years making an honest living. His notoriety doesn't come until 1878, following a dispute with Victorian Police Constable Fitzpatrick. This led to Ned and his brother Dan being wanted by authorities, so they ran out to the bush and hid out. Following a shootout with police at Stringy Bark Creek, where Ned and his gang shot Victorian police officers, the Kelly gang were now considered outlaws, and due to a recent law being passed, outlaws could now be shot by anyone and no questions asked. For the next 2 years, Kelly and his gang raided, looted, and lived off the land, gaining a lot of sympathizers along the way. However, it was Ned Kelly's last stand that ultimately put him in the history books, and it would be the stuff of legend. On the 27th of June 1880, the Kelly gang held up the Glenrowan Inn and planned on a train carrying an army of Victorian police coming to Glenrowan, so they devised a plan. The plan was to rip up the rails and the train would derail and be destroyed, killing off the army. The next part was to make homemade armour from iron plough mould boards that could easily deflect bullets, and this would allow them to search for any survivors of the wreck unharmed. However, the police were alerted to the plans and ambushed Kelly and his gang at the Glenrowan Inn at around 3 a.m. The Kelly gang exchanged shots with the army of police, and donning their homemade iron armour, they fought into the night. At around 7 a.m, the fighting was still going on, but Ned Kelly arose from the misty morning and stumbled through the trees, firing at police from the rear. This lasted about 15 minutes before he finally succumbed to his injuries and was captured by police. The other members of the Kelly gang perished in the battle, and only Ned survived the affair. Ned Kelly was ultimately sentenced to death in 1880 despite a massive petition from sympathizers. Today, Ned Kelly's legacy is highly debated, and some see him as a hero who stood up to the authority who abused their powers, while others deem him to be a villainous thug and nothing but a murderer. Number 5. The Melbourne Gangland Wars. Australia, in my humble opinion, has the most diverse and unique range of gangsters in the world. This whole saga is a prime example of that statement. Carl Williams, the Morans, Alphonse Gangitano, the Carlton Crew, the Munster, Benji Veniamin. These guys would become household names across Australia during the decade-long saga of violence and tit-for-tat spate of killings, which would become known as the Melbourne Gangland Wars. 36 lives would be taken between the years of 1998 and 2010. Now, the history of the wars is a little convoluted and can get a bit complicated, so to spare you any boring or irrelevant information, it basically centres around the fight for control over Melbourne's drug trade. In January 1998, gangster and prominent member of the Carlton Crew, Alphonse Gangitano, was shot dead in his Melbourne home by suspects and fellow underworld figures Graham the Munster Kennebra and Jason Moran. During 1998, a series of violent attacks and slayings were reported and saw the rise of Carl Williams, who would go on to become a major player, and he was also associated with Jason and Mark Moran, who were also associated with the drug scene in Melbourne. In 1999, Carl Williams was shot in the stomach by the Moran brothers, and police found that this was related to a dispute about the ownership of a pill pressing machine. After recovering, Williams then became determined on revenge and sets out to become the city's biggest drug manufacturer. Carl Williams gets his own back by shooting Mark Moran in June of 2000. Associated member Dino Debra was rumoured to have pulled the trigger, and was later killed in retribution by the Morans. During these slayings, the gang's more high-profile members would either order a hit from their underlings or hire a hitman, and the go-to hitman of the time was none other than Andrew Benji Veniamin. His services became in high demand, and a lot of the killings he was either suspected of or actively involved in. It was Carl Williams, however, that became Veniamin's main contract, beginning an almost exclusive gun-for-hire and personal friend of Williams. By 2003, the number of dead gangsters was alarming Victorian police, who had figured all of this was related to a few main conspirators, and the Purana Task Force was formed to investigate Melbourne's underworld. It's around this time that Carl Williams flirts with the media and dubs himself Mr. Premier. Also in 2003, Jason Moran and his minder Pascal Barbaro were killed as they sat in a parked blue van outside an Auskick football clinic in Essendon. 5 children were witness to the murder, including Moran's 6-year-old twin boy and girl. In March of 2004, contract killer Andrew Benji Veniamin was shot and killed by Mick Gatto in a Carlton pizza restaurant. Mick Gatto was also suspected of being associated with the Honoured Society, also called Ndrangheta, a Calabrian mafia-type organisation. Gatto was cleared of the charges on the grounds of self-defence. By June of 2004, after being under heavy surveillance of Purana Task Force, Carl Williams is arrested, charged and convicted of drug trafficking charges. And in October 2004, he was given a 7-year jail sentence. He served his time at HM Bowen Prison in maximum security and was killed by fellow inmate Matthew Johnson in 2010. And that is where the wars end. If you would like to learn more about it and see a more detailed version of events, check out my other video on the subject, and I do apologize for the quality in advance. It was one of my first videos. Number 4, the Chamberlain case. If you're not from Australia and you hear the phrase, "A dingo's got my baby," this is the case that started it. This high-profile case divided Australians and remains debated even today. It had a massive amount of media attention and public interest was at an all-time high. Michael and Lindy Chamberlain arrived at Ayers Rock, now called Uluru, on the 16th of August 1980 with their 2 sons, Aidan and Regan, and their baby daughter, Azaria. The following day, the family explored the area and climbed the rock. That evening, the family cooked dinner at a communal barbecue area and chatted with other families. Lindy settled Regan and Azaria to sleep in the tent and returned to the barbecue area. At around 8 p.m, Azaria was heard to cry out. As Lindy went to check on her, she saw a dingo leaving the tent. Lindy dived frantically into the tent and found her baby gone. Her cry, "A dingo's got my baby," rang out across the campground. It has since become etched into Australia's cultural memory. Despite extensive searches of the area, including aid from Aboriginal trackers, Azaria was never found. Initially, an inquest found that Azaria had met her death when attacked by a wild dingo. In an unprecedented move, Coroner Dennis Barrett allowed his concluding remarks to be televised.
I have taken the unusual step of permitting these proceedings to be televised today in the hope that by direct and accurate communication, such innuendo, suspicions and gossip may finally cease. I doth find that Azaria Chamberlain, a child then of 9 weeks of age and formerly of Mount Isa, Queensland, met her death when attacked by a wild dingo whilst asleep in her family's tent at the top camping area, Ayers Rock, shortly after 8 p.m. on the 17th of August 1980.
However, a lot of people were dissatisfied with the ruling and demanded another look into it. How could a dingo attack a human? Dingo attacks on humans are extremely rare, and the species native to Australia are known to be quite timid and avoid humans whenever possible. The Northern Territory government and police quashed the initial inquest's findings with the help of forensic expert Professor James Cameron, and a second trial began, one that saw the Chamberlains being charged with their daughter's murder. The case became a national media sensation, and it seems everyone had their opinions on the verdict of Azaria's parents. The trial called into question the bloodstains found in the backseat of the Chamberlains' car, which the prosecution argued belonged to an infant. Australia watched every moment, captivated. Outside the courthouse, stalls were set up selling souvenirs and t-shirts. The Chamberlains were ultimately found guilty of murder, and Lindy was sentenced to life in prison, while Michael was given an 18-month suspended sentence for being an accessory after the fact. It wasn't until 1986 that Azaria's blood-stained matinee jacket was found at Uluru, after searchers were looking for body parts belonging to another fallen climber. The matinee jacket was a crucial piece of evidence in the case, as police and prosecutors claimed it didn't exist. After pressure was put on the Northern Territory government, Lindy Chamberlain was released from prison. In response, the Northern Territory offers them a pardon, but this still indicates guilt in Australia. It wasn't until 1988 that the Chamberlains were cleared of all guilt, and 3 decades later, in 2012, the death certificate of Azaria Chamberlain was updated, with the cause of death being noted as a dingo attack. There's also a book called Evil Angels, The Case of Lindy Chamberlain, released in 1985, and a movie based on the book similarly titled, with Meryl Streep portraying Lindy Chamberlain, that came out in 1988. Number 3. The Backpacker Murders. Visiting a different country can be a little intimidating for some. Hitchhiking in a foreign country is a different story altogether. Combine that with a serial killer who picks up random backpackers in an isolated part of the country, and you've basically got a horror film come to life. Now, I've talked about this next case a few times before, but it always seems to pop up in one form or another, and that's why it's at number 3. Ivan Milat, The Backpacker Murders. One of Australia's most well-known serial killers, Ivan Robert Marko Milat, was from a Croatian-Australian family and grew up fairly normal. The 5th out of 14 children, young Ivan was a fairly normal, athletic, and a typical Aussie bloke. Years later, however, close family members would remember Ivan as displaying some antisocial behaviours at a young age. A fascination with guns could be written off easily as typical young male interests, but entering into adulthood, he would be flirting with the idea of kidnapping young hitchhikers, and this eventually graduated to murder. Ivan Milat was working for the Roads and Transport Association, or RTA, in New South Wales when his murder spree began. This job afforded Milat the opportunity to travel the state's highways and become knowledgeable of all the isolated areas, such as the Belanglo State Forest. His MO was to pick up young travellers and tourists along the Hume Highway in New South Wales and then incapacitate them. After Milat subdued his victims, he then took them to several secluded areas of the Belanglo State Forest, where he would torture and murder them, sometimes even using their bodies for target practice with his guns, while they were still alive. A total of 7 victims would meet their grisly fate at the hands of Milat over the course of 3 years, beginning in 1989. 3 German backpackers, 2 British backpackers, and 2 Australian travellers from Melbourne. And these are just the ones we know about. More on that in a little bit. The bodies of the victims weren't found until 1992 when, by chance, 2 runners in the Belanglo State Forest stumbled across the remains of Milat's last victims, British backpackers Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark. This led to 5 more bodies found in the forest at different sites. It became evident early on that a serial killer was on the loose. This sparked a media frenzy and panic within the Australian public, more so in the state of New South Wales. It was a British tourist by the name of Paul Onions who turned out to be Ivan Milat's one that got away and effectively ended his serial killing. Onions alerted New South Wales authorities in 1993 after hearing it on the radio in the UK, and was instantly reminded of his ordeal with Milat in 1990. His story was corroborated by New South Wales police, who found his earlier police statement of the incident, and also with the woman who saved his life. The rego number of the vehicle recorded belonged to one Ivan Milat. After being placed under police surveillance, Milat was finally arrested in 1994. His guilty verdict would not be passed until 1996 after an 18-week trial, and he was given a life sentence on each count without the possibility of parole. He was also convicted of the attempted murder, false imprisonment, and robbery of onions, for which he received 6 years imprisonment for each. Ivan Milat would later die in prison at the age of 74 in 2019. His crimes caused widespread panic and would ultimately become one of the inspiration for the Australian horror movie franchise Wolf Creek. Years later, it would come out that Ivan Milat's nephew was also convicted of murder, and there are some rumors that there may be more of Milat's victims that we don't know about, still buried or hidden somewhere in the Belanglo State Forest. Number 2. The bodies in the barrels. Also called the Snowtown Murders. If you thought Ivan Milat was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet, kiddo. This serial killing is pretty gruesome, so full discretion is advised. This case is also very complicated. It involves a lot of people at different times and places, but most people will know of the bodies found in the barrels at Snowtown in South Australia, although the murders mostly took place in or around Adelaide. A total of 12 victims would lose their lives at the hands of a group of murderers orchestrated and led by John Bunting. The other perpetrators are a bit of a list, but the main four are John Bunting, Robert Wagner, James Blasakis, and Mark Hayden. Under the orders of John Bunting, who had a deep-seated hate of homosexual men and pedophiles, the group would carry out extreme torture on their victims, sometimes using electricity, and then murder them, disposing of the victims' bodies into plastic drums filled with acid, where they were moved around from place to place, eventually finding their way to an abandoned bank vault in Snowtown. The victims were chosen by the group under the suspicion of Bunting, who routinely added people who he had suspected of pedophilia to what he called his rock spider wall. None of the accusations ever turned out to be true, and in the end, the victims were chosen at random, including several members of Bunting's group. South Australian police were initially following up on the disappearance of Mark Hayden's wife, and this eventually led them to Snowtown. And on the 20th of May, 1999, the remains of 8 victims were found by South Australian police in 6 plastic barrels in a disused bank vault. A further 2 bodies were found buried in the backyard of Bunting's house in Adelaide. Police then arrested the remaining members of the group. The trial of Bunting and Wagner lasted almost 12 months, the longest in the history of South Australia. Both were later convicted of the murders. Bunting received 11 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and Wagner received 10 life sentences under the same conditions. James Blasakis and Mark Hayden were also tried and convicted, but on different grounds. Blasakis was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences with a non-parole period of 26 years, and Hayden was sentenced to 25 years with a non-parole period of 18 years. More than 250 suppression orders prevented publication of the details of this case. However, in early 2011, a judge lifted the remaining orders in response to a request by the producers of the film Snowtown, a dramatization depicting the murders of the events leading up to them. The notoriety of the murders has led to an economic boost from tourists visiting Snowtown, but created a lasting stigma. The town also wanted to change its name to Rosetown at one point, but nothing ever eventuated of this. Today, the Snowtown murders are remembered as one of Australia's biggest crimes and frequently cited, among other high-profile crimes, as a crime that shook the nation. Number 1. Well, you probably guessed what this one is. The Port Arthur Massacre.
That's the shotgun.
That's a shotgun.
Stay inside. I'm pretty sure someone's got a gun. No, in fact, we're bloody positive of it. There's somebody going crazy shooting people here.
On April the 28th, 1996, one of, or if not, the most devastating events in Australia's history unfolded at the historic Port Arthur settlement of Tasmania. A mass shooting took place on an unsuspecting public at the popular tourist site, and a total of 35 innocent lives were lost and another 23 wounded. The lone gunman was later named as 28-year-old Martin Bryant from Hobart, a young man with a history of mental health issues and frequently displayed disturbing behaviour. Bryant began the day by killing an elderly couple who were the owners of Port Arthur's Seascape guest house. Some theorise that the killings were Bryant's retaliation for the owners refusing to sell to his father. Bryant's father later died by his own hand, an action which Bryant is said to have blamed on his depression over not being able to buy the property. After having lunch on the deck of the Broad Arrow Cafe, located at the site of the historic Port Arthur prison colony, Bryant entered the restaurant, removed a Colt AR-15 rifle from his bag, and began shooting. After killing 22 people in rapid succession, Bryant left the restaurant for the car park, where he continued his shooting spree, killing the driver of 2 tour buses, some of their passengers, and a mother and her 2 small children, among others.
He did not say one word. He never ran. He walked everywhere, just shooting people.
On his way out of the car park, he shot 4 people in a BMW and drove the car to a nearby petrol station, where he shot 1 woman and took a man hostage, before driving back to the Seascape guest house. After an 18-hour standoff with police, Bryant set the guest house on fire, ran outside, and was captured. He apparently killed the hostage sometime earlier. Bryant initially pleaded not guilty to the 35 murders, but changed his plea and was sentenced to life in prison, never to be released. Australia's maximum sentence. The Broad Arrow Cafe and its environment were turned into a place for reflection and a memorial. People across Australia and the world were horrified by Bryant's actions. In the hopes of preventing similar crimes, gun control laws in many areas of Australia were significantly strengthened in the aftermath of the tragedy. The government introduced a gun buyback scheme, which was also later implemented in New Zealand after the Christchurch mosque attacks. I do have a full-length documentary on Port Arthur, so if you would like to learn more about that, then you can find the link to it in the description below. And that is the top 10 biggest crimes in Australia. What are your thoughts? Did I miss one that was important to you? Should I make another one? Let me know in the comments below. Friendly reminder to anyone who is interested in bonus content, you can join Beyond the Shadows for exclusive updates, members-only videos, and behind-the-scenes content. Check out the link for more info. And as always, if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and click that notifications bell to keep up to date with the latest videos. And together, we can explore the strange, the terrifying, the unknown, the shadow matter. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Shadows. Today I'm going to take you behind the scenes of what it takes to create an episode. Today I'm working on the top 10 biggest crimes of Australia. Australia has a very unique criminal history beginning, and that's an intro. Just like that.